Welcome to tonight's program. My name's Amy McDonald, and I'm an education consultant for the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center, BHEC for short. I'm also a teacher at Chait Valley High School. And even though our physical office space remains closed, we're excited to be able to continue our programming online, reaching audiences across the nation. So tonight's program is part of our series titled Bearing Witness, Stories of the Holocaust. Noted Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory, coined the expression, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. So as you hear stories from the Holocaust during our Bearing Witness programs, you become a witness with the responsibility to remember and to tell others what you learned. And this reflects the very essence of our work with the BHEC to remember the Holocaust survivors who lived in our midst and to learn from their experiences so that we can create a better future. So during the program tonight, everybody's going to remain muted, but we welcome your questions after the presentation. And in the beginning, we'll start that via the chat box. So if you click on the conversation bubble at the bottom of your screen, and when you click on that, the chat box will appear and you can type in your questions. And please remember that whatever you type in that box, you send by default to the whole group. Don't be like my students and type in questions that you don't want me to see, okay? And it could be that at the end, it could be that we just unmute everybody and we can have more of a discussion. We'll just kind of see how that goes. So after our lecture, we'll have a period for questions. I'll take it from the chat box and I will direct them to our guest. And so now a little bit about our special guest. Anna Wrobel, an American historian, teacher, and Holocaust Studies educator, uses original poetry as a creative means for historical and cultural transmission. The daughter of Holocaust survivors, her mother a partisan and her father a soldier, Anna has presented at the Puffin Foundation on Jewish resistance in World War II and works with the Jewish Partisans Educational Foundation, to which her mother Etta was a founding consultant. Anna has 2 poetry collections, and this is very fitting because, as she told me, this is National Poetry Month, Marengo Street in 2012, and The Arrangement of Things in 2018. Her poetry appeared in the University of Maine's Holocaust Human Rights Center art poetry exhibit, Dilemma of Memory, and is included in the Maine Jewish history exhibit at the State Museum. On a personal note, I first met Anna in 2011 at the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous Summer Institute at Columbia University. I think that experience was a defining moment for both of us as Holocaust educators. Over the years, I've stood in awe and been incredibly moved by her parents' stories. In fact, her mother, Etta's picture hangs in my classroom, even as we speak. Also, over the years, Anna has been a mentor, an ally, and a dear, dear friend to me. She is an inspiration to me as a teacher, but especially as a friend. So without further ado, joining us all the way from Portland, Maine, please welcome Anna Wrobel.
Hello, everybody. I will begin. I'm going to basically read a series of poems to you, and I'm going to put them in a context before reading each one. So there'll be a little historical and biographical context around them. This first piece is called From Nothing. Families, these are my parents, Henry Wrobel and Etta Chait Wrobel. And the families of Holocaust survivors, all of us, originate at the very, very edge of history. My parents and all of the survivors like them, and we, their children, are really statistical improbabilities. So we really do live at the edge of history. Our survivor parents were not just witnesses to the great event, but they were the event. And we descendants, indeed, are the witnesses. And this poem is called From Nothing. What must it be like to sit in your mind, stand in your memory, oceans of glass long broken, ever unswept, still piercing. I swam towards you, then away in turns, as a moon waxes and wanes, ever repeating wanting and not wanting. I've inherited your memory anesthetized. It only hurts when I cry. Once in a while, it's possible for me to be in my life without being in yours, but who am I kidding? Your lives matter more than mine. They have to, for my sake. For theirs, all the children ascended from you. You are Eve and you are Adam. We are nothing without you. This is not a figure of speech. We are nothing without you. Period. End of quote, exclamation point. You are the originals, the very root of life. From ash you came, from smoke you were saved. From oceans of blood you arose, anthropods on the shoreline, you who walked out of the great nothing. And so I will sit in your mind, stand in your memory, swim in your seas of broken glass, every other step still piercing. I'd like to introduce you to my parents, each one in turn. But first I'll say a little something about them together. This is Henry Wrobel and Etta Hyatt Wrobel. This is actually their, you might call it their wedding photo. They were married in what was then Breslau, Germany, soon to become Wrocław, Poland in 1945, in the spring of 1945. My mother is a bit glowing. She was pregnant in this photograph. My parents came from the same town, a town called Luków in east central Poland, halfway between Warsaw and Lublin in the Lublin district. She was a town girl. He was raised in the countryside in an orchard. She was middle class and he kind of peasant working class. So there were a lot of differences between them and in terms of the friends and the crowds they hung out with, but there were some similarities. And these similarities also had something to do with their survival. They were both young, single, strong, athletic. She was the captain of the soccer team and the volleyball team. He could climb a pine tree, a 100-foot fir tree in seconds. They were both very, very strong and athletic. They were both skilled and quick learners, and they both spoke in authentic Polish. What I mean by that is that there were no Yiddishisms in their Polish. My mother spoke a very literate and very educated Polish, and my father spoke a very kind of peasant and working class Polish, but in both cases, there were no real Yiddishisms that inflected their language. And they both had Polish Catholic friends, a lot of them. And they both loved Poland dearly before the war. They had the good fortune to come of age as teenagers, to come of age during the time when Poland was led by a leader named Marshal Pilsudski. The reason it was fortunate is because all anti-Jewish laws were eliminated under Pilsudski's watch, and Jews and other minorities were made completely equal citizens in the period between World War I and almost World War II. Unfortunately, Pilsudski died in 1935 because as soon as he died, very nationalistic and quasi-fascist forces came out and created anti-Jewish laws in Poland, sort of similar to the ones that were taking place in Germany. One big difference was that in Germany, they were very uniformly enforced, but not in Poland. In Poland, they were very flexibly enforced or not enforced. In the town they lived in, there wasn't a lot of anti-Semitism, but just 20 kilometers away, there may be a town that was really quite hellish for Jews. So again, these laws were enforced in a very uneven manner. So that's my parents as a unit in one little nutshell. My mother, Etta, and I'm going to read a poem called Equipment in just a moment. My mother, Etta, was born in 1916. Oh, this, by the way, I'm sorry. This photograph is the book that my mother wrote with some help from a bunch of us. This is My Life, My Way, the extraordinary memoir of the Jewish partisan in World War II Poland, written with Jeanette Friedman and my sister Shane, who is with us tonight, and my partner Jim, and I had a lot to do with editing the book as well. She was born in 1916, died in 2008. Etta was the lone survivor of a family of 12. When the Nazis walked in and they assigned her to slave labor, they assigned her to something called the Arbeitsamt, the Jewish Employment Office, because she could read German as well as excellent Polish, etc. Her father recruited her very early on to do resistance, and in that office, she did what I would call paper sabotage. There are obviously details we might talk about later. She also freed Polish slave labor women from cages that they were kept in at a nearby factory. She did that in the middle of the night. With the first Nazi action, her mother and the youngest children, there were 10 children in all, and the youngest children were taken away to the gas at Treblinka. She was eventually denounced by someone who discovered the paper sabotage that she was doing in the employment office, and she ended up going to a Gestapo prison as a political prisoner. But being a Jew, of course, they were going to eventually execute her. And they interrogated her and tortured her weekly. She never gave any information. And eventually, and again, these are all stories that could make 3-hour movies. Eventually, it took several months, but an escape was arranged, somebody in the prison was working with her father outside of the prison, and she was aided by a madam who was actually imprisoned with her. And the madam's sons, adult sons who were pimps, were all part of this plan of escape. Again, this could be a book in itself. When she got back to the ghetto, she was hidden in the ghetto, but eventually there was a second Nazi action to destroy the ghetto, and they burned the ghetto down. The building she was in, fortunately, did not completely burn. She was able to get out of the building and ran away into the local woods, where there was a preset destination for anybody who might survive the actions. The only other member of her family that survived that action was her father, who met her in the woods. Several of her brothers and sisters at that point were captured and either killed on the spot or taken to Treblinka. When she got to the woods, she was a partisan. She was one of the leaders. She was the only woman leader of her group in the woods. The group sort of, let's say, vacillated between 60 and 80 members, depending on how many had been killed and how many were joining them. If you take a look at my mother, in Poland, she was assessed as looking very Polish, as looking very Catholic Polish. And she was under the guise of being a Catholic student, university student from Warsaw. And she had false baptismal papers of a young Polish woman named Elizabeth, who'd already been killed by the Nazis. The young woman's father gave my mother these baptismal papers, and my mother basically, with long braids, a cross, and pretending to be a university student, was smuggling guns and food and medicine and finding out where they could hide Jews or where Jews were being hidden at the time. So given you, she was the valedictorian of her high school. She had every intention to go on to university. One might say that the war very, very much interrupted her plans. And so how does a woman like this, who's, middle class, educated, ready to go off to university, how does she sort of transition to the roles that she has to take during this period? And this is a poem about my mother's partisan work, or just about her in general, called Equipment. What in her life equipped her to dig a bullet from her leg, to lie still under many bodies until decay and stone seeped into blood and breath? What in her life equipped her for smuggling the few guns a farmer may be bought for, hoping the SS or Home Guard hadn't gotten to him first? What in her life equipped her for executing traitors, for burning down squealers and Jew murderers? What in her life equipped her to see a pregnant sister butchered, ghetto burning, brothers shot, running, father gone to forgotten grave in a hole somewhere in the surrounding woods? What in her life equipped her to walk alone through this life, always dancing for the dozen, seeing traces of eyes and hands in children she dared to deliver from the fires and the pits. And the next piece I'd like to read will be about my father. It's called Hearing Something New. This is an obviously wounded photograph of my father in his Red Army uniform. He was a soldier in the Soviet Army during World War II. As I said, he was born in 1918 and died in 2013. He was raised in an orchard by the only religious Jewish family living on a noble woman's estate, surrounded very much by Polish Catholic peasants. And they were very much beloved on that estate. Most of his friends were peasant boys that he ran around in the fields and meadows with, climbed trees with, right? When he was 17 years old, again, a whole other story in itself, he ended up going on a cartography, a map-making mission to Siberia, where he built log cabins. Back in Luków as a young man, he worked in small factories in Luków, a wood-turning factory of axe handles, foundry, a small foundry, worked in a candy factory, various jobs that he had. When the Nazis came in September 1st, 1939, his mother was killed in the very first couple of days. The Nazis came in with these low-flying Stuka planes that just, had machine guns on them and just shot down people right on the roads. His mother was at the railroad station selling sandwiches to the Polish soldiers coming through on the trains, and she was shot practically in half on that very, very day, on one of the very first days. His father was wounded, but wanted to stay in Poland because at some point, the Russians sent vans and trucks into eastern Poland to actually evacuate a number of Jews into Russia. So to suggest that people didn't know what might be happening is absurd, because the Soviets their intelligence seemed to tell them that the Jews were in grave danger in Poland. My father and his older brother and his younger brother did manage to get on those trucks and vans and go into Russia. He tried to convince his father to go, but his father said, what are they going to do to an old man? And he wanted to be buried with his wife. Of course, that's not what happened. Eventually, his father was shot in some mass grave in the woods, he later found out. He tried to get his sister with a couple of kids to come and, get on the vans and come into Russia. But her husband was very, very anti-Soviet and would not go. So they all ended up going to the gas chambers at Treblinka, his sister and the children and her husband, right? When he first got into Russia, the war had not yet come to Russia. His older brother was sent with wife and small child to Siberia, not for punishment, but because he was a master welder, and it was in Siberia and way in the east that the Soviet Union was building up its military capacity. And as a master welder, his older brother was sent there to work on military equipment. His younger brother, only 15 years old, was sent to a kind of a high school orphanage. And I've always, and that was the reason that his younger brother ended up being actually the most literate member of the family, because he was in that Soviet high school for a few years, even during the war, right? So after my mother died in 2008, my father and I spent a lot of time whenever I'd visit him, just sitting around every meal, just talking about things. And as he grew older, he opened up more and more and more with these stories. And every time I would listen to him, I'd run upstairs and I would just jot down as much as I could remember. But sometimes he'd say things that would stop me in my tracks, because they was with things that I just never knew. And this is one of those occasions. It's a poem called Hearing Something New. My father is a completely poetic creature at this point, and I feel almost mercenary using him to stoke my pen to words. We break for lunch. Not a meal goes by without surprise and revelation. He was there in the summer of '44 at the liberation of Majdanek, where 895,000 went to gas and dust. Nothing else ever happened there. He asked his captain about the mountains of tiny shoes next to the hills of eyeglasses. The Russian officer replied, his first tears in a year, "Henry, these are your Jewish children." Dad sips his tea, coughs from a bite of corn muffin, and wipes his eyes under a pair of spectacles that got away. Now, this photograph is of my parents. Again, their wedding photograph is a perfect accompaniment to the next poem, which is called Waiting. I've already described to you that my parents had many differences in class, culture, education, community, peer groups, etc. Theirs was a marriage. The likelihood of them coming together was very unlikely. This was very much a marriage made by war, all right? And of course, just to note, again, most of the survivors, just like most people in resistance, were very young. Usually, most survivors were from the ages of teenage to young adult, people who were least weighted with family. So this is a poem called Waiting, about my parents, I guess you might say, finding each other. Waiting, for Henry and Etta. Did you wait for each other in some constellation neither was aware of? At a time when seeing stars was illegal, impossible, all eyes on the mud and dust and ash and blood, when to gaze upward was to lose sight of the one foot in front of the other, the pits and quicksand everywhere, on every front and side and back. And in that far constellation, while planets rotated on axes in despair, as tens of millions blew away, sucked deep into vacuums, did you two cast such soft starlight across light years, as wide as galaxies, as close as two sides of a small town's tracks? You found a fate made of war, the only order out of chaos, the only glimmer in oblivion. You didn't know that you waited each for the other when there was no one else left to wait for. The next poem I'm going to read is called Breslau, or What's Breslau Got to Do with It? I'm going to run through a series of photographs here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my parents' survivor journey after the war and after they married. This is my father in the DP camp uniform. I'll say a little something about the DP camps first. My parents in the post-war period moved ever west. My father, let me just backtrack a little bit. In the war in the Soviet Union, he was eventually very badly wounded. His head was blown open. He was in a coma for 22 days. And when he came out of that coma, the Russian medicine really did save his life. The MASH units were quite incredible, actually. And they let him in uniform, still in the army, go back to Poland to see if they, as when he was recovering, to see if there were any survivors. When he got back to his town, he knew which of his family had died and which of his family had escaped into Russia. There was also a sister, an older sister, who was of the Soviet Union and being a nurse for their army. But as he and my mother got together, and as he started to hear more and more about the word going on the street was that the Soviet Union was little by little closing their borders to the West, and my father wanted to go west. He didn't really want to stay in the East. They were forever moving from East to West. At some point, my father rescued my mother from an assassination plot. That's a whole other story. And their first stop, as I said, was Breslau, where they were married, or Wrocław. My brother Hal was born during that period in late 1945. And as I said, my father's radar, he was a scout in the Soviet army, and for good reason. He had something like 26 different senses. He knew that the Soviets were closing the borders, so they kept moving. Breslau or Wrocław wasn't Western enough. They had a very tough journey with a very sick baby, and my mother was also quite ill. Crossing to the American zone of Germany. They ended up near Frankfurt. The first displaced persons camp they were in was quite overcrowded, and a new one was being opened up with a British Jewish woman general supervising this particular camp. The British and the Americans actually cooperated quite a bit in their various occupation zones in West Germany. This particular British general, her family, her entire nuclear family had been killed in the Blitzkrieg, in the bombings of England. So she decided to devote her next part of her military life to helping the Jews in displaced persons camps in Germany. General Eisenhower was present for the opening of this camp, and it was he personally who put men like my father in charge of the camp security and organization. He was looking for healthy young men and former soldiers, and my father was one of them. If you go to the next couple of pictures, we'll look at how many came back to life. This is my mother with the two babies that she had in this German displaced persons town. That is my brother Hal on the right and my sister Shane, or Scheindel, on the left. Shane was born in that displaced persons camp and ended up coming to the United States soon after this, when she was about 4 months old. In the next picture, you'll see my parents again with the two babies and some cousins who had survived as well with their first two children. And there was coming back to life, but there was grief as well. If you go, this is a picture of one of the last graves ever in this cemetery. These are the last graves in the cemetery in this displaced persons town. My brother found that out decades later. That's my father on the left. In the middle, crying, is his younger sister, Sarah. And on the right is his older sister, Luba, who had been the nurse in the Soviet army. Sarah had been married to her first husband and was pregnant, were riding in a Jeep with her husband and another man. A truck crashed into them. The two men were killed and Sarah lost the baby. So this is, this was the entire displaced persons camp. Everybody was out, and the grief was beyond. I'm sure they carried they were carrying enormous amount of grief that released itself in this terrible situation. Was it an accident? Was it on purpose? Sometimes the Jews in these camps were in danger, right? But we really don't know, all right? So I'd like to read this poem called What's Breslau Got to Do with It? And just a little note that while General Eisenhower knew very well that my father had been an ally in the Soviet army, as time passed and the Cold War descended, it was getting harder and harder to ever admit that you might have ever been in the Soviet army. So this poem's called What's Breslau Got to Do with It? The city they claimed was Breslau, and I don't know why. Had that contested Silesian gathering place been a stop on the way to American largesse, too late, but finally come? West German towns with beds and blankets, bandages and bread. What made them say Breslau when asked their place of birth? What rumors of exclusion had already spread? Was East Poland too near the Russian bear, now enemy, no longer friend? Go west, young man, Greeley exclaimed. The refugees in 46 could not have known his name. Still west it was, ever west, until one day a general of fame of Midwest German seed saluted a soldier of the Soviet war, giving welcome, assigning duty. Glad to see this ally indeed, his wife and son, a rescued Eden. Then the paperwork, the endless applications. Place of birth, it asked, and they both wrote Breslau. I don't know why, and I forgot to ask. Well, eventually, as you saw that photograph of the two babies, shortly thereafter, my parents made the journey to the United States as after the political and legal hurdles of the visa approval. They emigrated to the United States on the USS Ernie Pyle ship under refugee status in August of 1947 with the two children you saw in that photograph. They were aided by a number of organizations, the Jewish Distribution Committee, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and the National Council of Jewish Women, amongst others. They also needed to have a family sponsor. There was a relative in the Bronx, New York. All of them lived in one room behind a tiny store in a slum area of Brooklyn where I was born a few years later. My mother's war trauma had really done a job on her physical condition. It had caused kidney ailments and very, very high blood pressure. And she was advised against any more pregnancies after my brother and sister. But she was pregnant with me, and my delivery was a very, very difficult one. And this next poem is called The Crib. To the leftovers of war in the slums of Brooklyn born, my crib. A shell without legs among garbage cans and rats. He took it back to the one room for 5 behind the tiny grocery on grease-grimy streets. She scrubbed until it shined and readied up the bed for my small body, brought here near death in kidney pain. They asked him who to save. She was so sick, her or me. He had 2 babies at home, stolen from death by days and months. Save my wife, said he. But we both came home, a brilliant doctor's mitzvah, good deed, an anonymous tikkun olam, repair of the world. She placed me to sleep in the dump-found crib, a gleam in sunshine, a light, 4 milk crates of wood he'd set down to hold me. Now, and their next picture, I'd just like to show you, this is my parents in front of that little grocery store on a Brooklyn street. By 1960, my father had left groceries both in Brooklyn and the Bronx because he really was an outdoorsman. As I said, he was raised in an orchard from 1960 to around 1985 or thereabouts. For 25 or 30 years, he actually was a contractor building small workforce housing on Staten Island, you know, for firemen and cops and nurses and teachers. That's what he ended up doing from 1960 forward. But we were raised in this next poem is called Shindle. And in our world, there were no grandparents. And this next picture is a picture of my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Shindle. And in the next picture is, this is some years later, this is Shindle and her husband Pinchas. This is my maternal grandparents. I still have trouble calling them grandparents. I find myself often saying my mother's father, my mother's mother. We never had any grandparents. It's always been funny to sort of like try to say my grandmother. I've gotten more used to it lately in speaking of them as my grandparents. We had no elders in our life. We had no grandparents. It was very rare. You'd hear a rumor of one of the survivors, you know, having grandparents in their life, but it was very, very rare. I personally never met anybody's grandparents in our refugee community. I didn't really know, I know this sounds funny, but when I was a little kid, I didn't know what old people were, right? I would see them on the street and I knew they were human, but I didn't know where they belonged or who they belonged to. I actually just assumed, this is a hard thing to say, but I just assumed that everybody's grandparents were dead before they were born. As a matter of fact, I just assumed that everybody's grandparents were murdered before you were born, all right? And one day I came home from school and I was very confused and shocked because a girl in my class was talking about what she'd done over Christmas vacation and she'd been with her grandparents. I didn't understand how that could be. And I asked my mother, how is it that she could be with her grandmother and her grandfather? And my mother just put her hands to her face and said, oh my God. And she explained to me that people had grandparents, but we didn't. And I looked at her and I said, you had grandparents? And she said, yes. I said, Daddy had a grandmother and a grandfather? And she said, yes. And it was so shocking. Their lives were absurdly disrupted. You know, any normalcy was completely shattered. And to learn on that day that we were born into a very abnormal situation. When I think about, you know, my children have grandparents, as I was a single mom for many years, so my children had grandparents, and I was thrilled to see my children have grandparents. My grandmother Scheindel was killed at Treblinka. My grandfather Pinchas here in this photograph was the only one who had survived from the family with my mother, but he was almost catatonic after the loss of his family, and she was carrying him around. He thought that he would end up being the death of her. So one day when she was on a mission, he got his last ounce of strength while everybody else was sleeping. He left the woods, went into town, gave himself up, and was shot in the woods, right? Because he was sure that he would be the reason that my mother would die also. So that's how he ended up. My father's mother, Rivka, as I said, was shot and killed in the early days of the German invasion. And my father's father, my paternal grandfather, Herschel, was wounded in the first days, and eventually he was shot into a mass grave. So this was the fate of my grandparents and the fate of many, many grandparents of survivors' children. But my mother spoke a lot about her parents. She spoke a lot about her mother. And I feel that I came to know her. My sister Shane is named after Scheindel. And so this poem is called Scheindel. Scheindel. How do you miss someone you don't know? How do you know what you're missing? I have seen your protection, been clothed in your breathing, our children you carried through dark and rough seas, the shattering of glass, the felling of trees. How rude of me to feign strangeness. How false to speak of missing when you've only just been away. As I said, I was born in Brooklyn, raised in the Bronx. A lot of concrete and tar, you know, were in my life. This next one is called Avon Woods. But my parents' relationship to the woods definitely penetrated my life. The woods, my father thrived in the woods. That's where he played throughout his whole youth. The woods were where my mother survived. And I have lived in several wooded environments since my young adulthood. British Columbia, the Galilee in northern Israel, Pennsylvania mountains, and for almost 5 years in the mountains of Maine, from 1975 to almost 1980. My parents came to visit us while living in the mountains, while I was living in the mountains of Maine. And they'd already been in the United States at that point, almost, I guess, 30 years at that point. And they'd been to a lot of wooded places, mountain places, but they'd never been any place where they felt this familiar. And so this is the town of Avon, Maine, and this is called the Avon Woods. My parents were actually walking around sniffing the air like deer, and it had something to do with the flora. It had something to do with a unique mix. Only years later did I realize what it was. There's very few places in the world that have sugar maple trees, especially mixed with pine. Well, one of those places is New England, and one of those places in the world is parts of Poland. And so that's what they were smelling, the aroma of the earth that would give birth to the combination of pine trees and sugar maples, which is actually a very rare scent. So this is called the Avon Woods. And this is a poem that was included in the State Museum's exhibit on Maine Jewish history. I think I was supposed to represent the hippie backwoods homesteaders or something like that, all right? The Avon Woods. Why do you live in the woods, she would say, hidden in pouring rain and ice, a broken bladder, a bullet in her leg, lying, sleeping in lice and ditches, a plentiful and constant fear. But she came back a second and a third time, walked old roads in early winter in oversized timber boots, breathed air she'd not tasted since Poland, a parallel flora perhaps, a snowflake finding its impossible twin. The first time he came, Dad took a tree, small pine bundled up in cloth, replanted in Queens, New York, a piece of me, Maine, Poland, himself. Under his gaze, it grew strong and symmetrical, likely more so than if left in the covered and competing forest. They've left that house now, a bit of Avon woods growing side by side with the Russian immigrants who settled in. This next poem is called Bottom of the Bag. This is one of my favorite pictures. There's me in the middle. I don't drink very often, but there I am with this big mug of beer, all right? And that's Amy next to me. And next to her, I remember, was a teacher from Croatia. I'm not sure about the other woman. I think she may have also been one of the teachers from Croatia who was at this Columbia conference where Amy and I met. And so Amy, I just have to say that I have gotten as far, I'll be talking about this in a moment, I've gotten as far as Krakow. I have not gotten as far in Poland as where my parents lived. And Amy has done something for me that is quite remarkable. Not once, but twice. She has gone to Treblinka to lay stones on the memorial stone for our town of Luków, as you can see right there. Just remarkable. There's no way, I don't know how I can thank Amy for this, but she did this for me, and it's just remarkable. But this is a poem really about my father. It was written a couple of years after his death, and I was reflecting upon that conference at Columbia University. This is called Bottom of the Bag. It can be dangerous to look through books and papers not seen in some years. The notes were there somewhere from a history conference at Columbia, the best I'd ever attended, from the professors to my Polish comrades, a highlight of my excessive education. Seeking the notes of Professor Riker's brilliant lecture on the Nuremberg laws, I came upon a small white paper scrap, a hastily written list, the to-dos of one about to take a trip, water plants, pay bills, call dad. That was then, this is now. I water plants, I pay bills. How many hundreds of things did I forget to ask you? What street in Warsaw will you hold up in for 10 days, a pile of books on political economy? What map of winding paths through Russia, Odessa, Persia, and Tashkent? What became of the Russian men you scouted with in the Soviet army? Did they live? What were their names? How you got rid of the guy mom came out of the woods with? What trails and trials to bring an ailing wife and sickly son across so many borders to a German town where Eisenhower put you in charge? Which cloak and dagger paths to get you back from a Polish black market through Czechoslovakian stations set up to secret refugees to the Yishuv in Israel? Was she still weeping when you returned? Or had she gone to silence in despair, only to leap up and scream when you appeared, a ghost, gone and returned? If you could be that returning ghost for me. I recall how you fell to sudden tears when I came out of the woods and stood at your door that December anniversary night. I hadn't realized then how much you might miss me, but I surely know now of my missing you. Water plants, pay bills, call dad. And also I'd like to dedicate this next poem. It's called The Profession, to all of these wonderful, wonderful teachers. I want to dedicate this to all the Holocaust Studies teachers and those who support this teaching. It is profoundly important and effective work when it is done well. Now, for me, as already being an American historian, already being a teacher, to turn onto a path of Holocaust Studies education, another history, another form of teaching, well, for me, that was a personal obligation, seeing as I was already a historian and a teacher. But for the others who do not have that personal obligation, it's just a miracle of compassion, truly a manifestation of Martin Buber's I-thou philosophy. So this next poem is called The Profession. And as Amy said earlier, some of my work was involved in an exhibit called The Dilemma of Memory, an art and poetry exhibit. And it starts that way, The Profession. Dilemma of memory indeed. Since they've gone, my memory is theirs and theirs is mine. Siamese twins recoiling from the knife. Too much heart and bone beat and think as one. Tellings permanent and vivid, as thick as space and time. I have pains in my leg where the emptiness resides, while smiles multiply as kindness is all there is to temper what comes of grief. I have always cried a lot, have always smiled a lot, have grieved as my mother between the laughter. Without grief, where is memory? And without memory, the disappeared disappear. Everyone cries at graduations when the baby pictures appear. Weddings when dads and daughters dance, star-crossed scenes in West Side Story. I keep seeing missing people, hoping to catch a glimpse of what they missed. I keep seeing Mara, belly round with new life butchered before the eyes of her mother and mine, her sister. And all I can think of is her young husband, no name remaining, murdered for shiny boots, not quick enough unshod. I see them all everywhere, as if the deaths of the last among you would stop the world's knowing, and it has. I would retire from this profession, the work of taking up your memory as my own, but I can't. Well, one thing led to another, as time passed, this next is called Mother in the Birch. I found myself chaperoning a couple of high school student trips to Europe. Both trips included Krakow and Auschwitz. As I said, I haven't gotten as far east to Eastern Poland where Luków is. I did fall in love with Krakow, however, and definitely want to go back, and hopefully we'll get to Eastern Poland as well. But while we were traveling from Prague to Krakow, we were on a bus and we were traveling from Slovakia to Poland through the Carpathian Mountains. And as we were approaching the Polish border for the first time, my first time in 2012, I was a nervous wreck. I didn't let anybody know, but I was both exhilarated but incredibly frightened to cross the border into Poland. This was already about 4 years after my mother had passed away. Because I felt the woods, as we were going through the Carpathian Mountains, the woods were just filled with the absence and the presence of so many lost Jews. I'm the first of my family to return to Poland. My mother, Etta, often said that she would have returned to Poland if there was even one proper grave to visit, but as there was not, she never did go back. I just want to make one little reference note because it comes up in this poem, and that is in Hebrew, the term for cemetery, the word for cemetery is Beit Chaim. Beit Chaim is Hebrew for cemetery. But quite literally, the words Beit Chaim means house of life. So in Hebrew, a cemetery is a house of life. And so I'm going to read this poem called Mother in the Birch. She met me there in a stand of birch, the last leg of Slovakia, just kilometers from the Polish Southlands. White birches glowed in dark Carpathians. I cried to know I was not to be left there alone. She would carry me, and I would be her eyes to see, her skin to feel Poland again. I held my breath. It was hers. Together we crossed the border. There, another shock of white birches witnessed our return. Were the others in there too? I am the first to come back since the time of murder. Love of the land pulsed through me like her blood. Beneath the cemetery nation still lies a house of life. And I'm just going to read two more pieces to you. This next one is called Vapor. This is a family photo of my mother's family with 7 out of the 10 children already born at this point. This was taken sometime in the 1920s. I just want to make a note on any photographs like this that were taken before the war. There were no photographs left in my mother's possession, but she had an aunt. My grandmother had a sister who emigrated to London in 1912. And through the 1920s and 1930s, there was even a visitation from London to Poland. But throughout those decades, the two families exchanged photographs. And in the summer of 1964, as a kid, I accompanied my mother for her first trip back to Europe, and she saw her mother's sister, her own maternal aunt. It was quite a day, quite a day. And so these are the very, very, very first images, the photographs that we received, the pictures of Scheindel and Pincus, of the grandparents, this photograph, and any pre-war photographs we received 1964, that summer in London. It's the first time I ever saw the faces of anybody in my mother's family. And one of her cousins in London was Philip, who copied all these photographs for her. He'd been in the British Army during World War II. And after the war, he was stationed in the British sector of Germany. And he kept going to the International Red Cross. Oh, every week he'd go to the International Red Cross if he could find a list of names of people who survived. After months and months of checking, he finally found my mother's name on one of those lists. He was given permission to come to the American sector to be with them. So that's when she first met that cousin from London as well. So I would like to read this poem called You Who Have Gone to Vapor. I look more deeply at your picture than I ever have. The paper's flat. You looked straight at me, but I gazed past your features. They weren't round and warm and touched. I don't know your names by heart, and 3 of the children not yet born. So I'll never know their faces. And should it matter? You once had flesh. You felt warm in your body, small though real. When I look into your faces, I think of how they horrified your child years, destroyed those small bodies. You who have gone to vapor. I looked hard at your picture. I think I felt something. Saw pluck in one face, profundity in another. Treblinka, the grave they made, took your round, warm features from any touch, my touch. The Metzaiva, the Jewish memorial stone from my mother, brought you home, all your names written in granite stone, recalled to memory and existence. Some names I can't put faces to. Deeper and harder, looking into faces, hoping there, myself may know me. And my mother is in the top row. She is second from left. And the young girl next to her on the left is Mara, who I referenced in the last poem about being killed while 8 months pregnant by a German soldier who used the butt of his rifle to basically kill both of them at the same time. That's because she kept looking for her husband and he kept telling her to sit down, etc. All right. And I will just end this with, now this is, My Mother Dances at Weddings is a poem that I do understand that so many of the survivors lived life very fully. They danced, they sang, the simchas abounded, they went to the theater, the movies, they went on vacation, they laughed. My mother could be made to laugh very, very easily in spite of the grief that she lived with every day. And so it's very important, the incredible rebirth. These are my parents' 8 grandchildren. The two right in the middle, both wearing black, happen to be mine with the sunglasses. That's my son, Barak. Next to him, to the left, is Corinna. To the left of her is Mara, my sister's daughter, Sarah, my sister's daughter, David, my sister's son. And to the right of Barak is Arleah, Esther, and Tova, the three daughters of my brother Hal, who died a couple of years ago in Israel. He'd been living there since 1973. And so this is, and by the way, this just happened to be at the bar mitzvah of my grandson, Elijah, who was my parents' great-grandson. And my parents did end up with, we have now 9 great-grandchildren descended from them. As I said, they were Adam and Eve. We really did come from nothing. So this is, my mother dances at weddings. Out of the whirlwind, my mother's feet. Out of the dust, my mother's dance. One bourbon, that's all it takes to get her to move, her hips to shake. She leads the ring around the floor, dance for herself, and so many more. The bride, the groom, a bar mitzvah boy, she exhales her blessings, inhales their joy. There is no burying any part of grief, so she steals these moments, a happiness thief. She taught me life is precious. She showed me the world is open. She practiced human dignity and preached a classless regard. She walked with power, but rejected its meanness. Seen by all as a will of iron, some photos might show her gentler and more fragile soul. My mother dances at weddings, kicks up her cracked and ancient heels, forgets the aching in her joints, loses the tightness in her chest, and casts off the shortness of her breath. Where the road does fork and we must choose, she follows the bridal train and not the graveside path. And we'll end with just a couple. This is a photograph of Henry and Etta with my grandson, Elijah, taken almost about 19 years ago. And in this next photograph is one of the last photographs of them together. And it kind of echoes that original headshot of their wedding, Henry and Etta Wrobel. And so at this point, we can take any kind of questions, comments that you have. Do you have anything in the chat room? Or?
I'm waiting for some questions in the chat.
Or comments of any kind.
Comments, yes. Anna, while we're waiting,
yes.
You mentioned that your dad, was your dad in the Warsaw Ghetto? What ghetto was he in?
No, he was
Or
not.
was it your mother?
My mother was in the Luków ghetto.
Okay.
Okay, they took, it was a small town of about 30,000 people, about 10,000 were Jews. And they really created a very tight little ghetto in that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Anne says, what a touching presentation. I so enjoyed the way you wove your family's story with your beautiful poetry.
Should we ask, maybe open it up to people if they'd like to
Yeah,
speak?
now Denise wants to know, are your poems published?
Some of them have been published in more eclectic collections, all right? There's a few that are in those collections that you talked about, but I am working on a manuscript of only poetry related to the Shoah and this kind of, let's say, second generation, first person experience. I am working on that manuscript. I have well over 100 poems. Even choosing what I needed for today is always kind of an anguishing experience because it's always hard to choose which ones I will, illuminate. But I am working on a manuscript. But yes, some of these poems are in my other collections. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Laura says, Anna, that was so moving, the stories and your beautiful translation into poetry. You spoke of your mom transitioning from a middle-class girl to a partisan. What about the transition back from a partisan into a wife and mother? Was that difficult for her?
That's a great question. You know, as a young woman, she was the tomboy. She was the one who, you know, as I say, she was the soccer player, the volleyball player. She's the one who would ride on a bicycle with shorts on, which was something that most of the nice Jewish girls didn't do. You know, she got a head wound that I always thought was from the war. And then I found out it was no, when she was a kid, she was just fooling around and she fell on something. And, you know, she was the one who, you know, wanted to go to university. Her younger sister, Mara, got married before she did, which was very unusual, but that's because she wanted to delay marriage. So what I'm getting at is that her original plans were like, I guess she figured she'd marry someday, but she really wanted to go to university, be a journalist, be a writer, etc. So obviously the war would change everything. And, you know, and the transition to being, I think the transition to being a mother was probably easier than the transition to being a wife, to tell you the truth. You know, after losing everybody, I think being pregnant and having children, as with so many of them, was the most important thing in the world. I want to remind you that, you know, again, a little biology lesson here, biology lesson is that women under extreme stress very often lose their periods, very often do not menstruate. And my mother hadn't had her period in a couple of years, and that's not unusual. So she just kind of assumed that she was a broken person and that she would never, ever have a kid. And she hadn't even yet gotten her period again when she did indeed get pregnant. And that was unexpected. And my mother was a tough person. And when the doctor told her she was pregnant, she hit him because she thought he was, you know, fooling around with her. And he said, "Don't hit me again. I swear you're pregnant." And that was, and my father hadn't, you know, my father had also been through tremendous trauma. They basically thought they were going to get on his motorcycle and go riding to who knows what. But you know, and lived a carefree life after all that trauma. And as soon as she was pregnant, it was just like, okay, now he becomes her personal soldier and just, that's it, protects her for the next 63 years of her life, basically. So I think that motherhood wasn't always easy for her, you know, but then again, coming out of these kind of traumas, I would think that regardless of what their life was like beforehand, that, you know, transitioning to motherhood and wife and a normal life would be very difficult. There's a new book out, or a recent book called The Last Million, about the last million refugees. A lot of it also has to do with the displaced persons camps. I haven't yet read it, but it's on my immediate to read list. Jews were in some of these displaced persons camps for a couple of years. And as the camps, at first they were horrible camps. I mean, places like Bergen-Belsen were being reused as DP camps, guarded by German soldiers who were prisoners. I mean, really, little by little, the DP camps actually got better. You saw the gardens that my mother, for example, and my parents were sitting in. In some, I know this sounds like a crazy thing to say, but in some ways their life was more idyllic in those towns, in those DP towns, than they were in the slums of Brooklyn. I mean, things got really rough in the United States. I mean, poverty was the first thing that you faced. So I think that those transitions, all of those transitions, were incredibly difficult and somewhat traumatic. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but yeah, getting back into life would have been the most important thing. Absolutely the most important thing to my mother, and having babies, and yeah, and replacing the Jews is, you know, I think that was very important.
Hey, Zoe, would you go ahead and unmute everybody?
I have the ability to unmute now.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to read a couple of these, and then Shane, I think you had your hand up. I'm going to read 2 of these comments, and then you ask your question. Okay. Leslie says, "Stunning poetry and presentation covering the spectrum of our humanity. Thank you so much. Just incredibly meaningful, insightful, and brilliantly evocative for those who have not had this experience." Frumi says, so very, very powerful. I especially love the last poem about your mom's joy at weddings and bar mitzvahs. Kathy, one of the most powerful presentations I've ever heard. Your poetry is so heartfelt. You've got people just talking. And, but I wonder, okay, Shane, can you unmute yourself and then ask your question?
What I was going to say actually was that picture of our parents at the DP camp where my mother is holding me and my brother in her lap and has this grin on her face of pure joy. I never saw that smile again growing up. When my sister said that probably the most joy they had was in that DP camp, once they came to America, life was very hard, very hard. I have to say that smile, that picture is very precious to me because it's the only time I've ever seen, though it's in a picture, my mother with that just totally open, joyful face.
Yeah. And if I just might say that picture also, you know, I mean, it's kind of a tangent, but people talk about survivor guilt. First of all, I don't believe in it, but that's me. I don't believe in the concept of survivor guilt. It's certainly not in the case of my mother and father. But when I look at that photograph and I see that smile you're talking about, I go, what are you talking about? You know, this is, you know, she's so happy to be able to be back in life, give life. And, you know, I think we must have heard the word life, you know, millions of times while we were growing up. It was absolutely the most important thing to her. Yeah. So, any other folks?
I wanted you to tell, you know, I've heard bits and pieces of these over the years, but I'm always amazed by the stories of your mom in the forest.
Yeah.
And the fact that she was really one of the only women with all of these male partisan fighters. And I've always wondered, you know, how was that for her and how did she maintain her mental toughness? I mean, how did she function? You know, when she was clearly supposed to be doing, you know, they expected her to have another role, but she refused.
Well, they didn't really, I'll just say this, you know, most people recognized my mother, I think even from very young, that she was not, you know, let's say for her traditional, generational, atypical female. And even, as I say, even as a child, she was refusing typical roles. I mean, she had much younger sisters who would, you know, sort of like make her put on her sweater when she went out. I mean, in other words, that they were like the motherly ones and she was the wild child. She was always there. I mean, she was like my sister. My sister was a great athlete. You know, the kind of girl that, like, if the guys were putting together a team, they were going to pick her before they were going to pick any other guys. I mean, she was always like that. She presented. She also can be very male identified. You know, in a lot of ways. If you knew her, she'd be quick to show you her authoritative spirit and her leadership. I'm sure it wasn't lost on them. Also, she's the only one of their troop, as far as I understand, who could just really get away with what she got away with disguising herself as a Polish Catholic. It was at one of those Columbia conferences, at one of our advanced seminars, that I learned more about why she was able to go undercover that way and disguise herself. I always knew she had the look. Okay. And I always knew that, you know, that she, you know, just could play the part. But we were at one of those conferences and they also indicate, I can't remember which professor it was talking about the fact that in order to disguise yourself as a Pole, and there was a number of things. A, you had to have the look. B, you had to have some kind of papers. And C, you needed to be a very quick learner. My mother was the valedictorian of her gymnasium, you know. She was very quick learner. To the day she was 92 years old, she could still recite Polish poetry by heart, right? She was a very, very quick learner because you need to learn all the catechism. You need to learn the Catholic saints. You need to learn all of these things. You need to be able to pick these things up. She probably already knew a lot of that already. But something else I learned at that JFR conference was that what I mentioned earlier, that when you spoke Polish, you couldn't have any Yiddish inflections in it. It would give you away in a minute. Any Polish person listening to you speaking would hear, let's say, a pronunciation that was slightly Yiddish, okay, even of a Polish word. It would give you away. My mother's Polish was perfect literary Polish without any of those Yiddishisms. My father's Polish was a perfect peasant Polish without any of those. And I hadn't realized till that conference how essential it was that you have this language that doesn't give you away with how you pronounce even a single word. And so, so she had the ability to do things that others could not do. And if you knew her from the first 5 minutes, you would recognize her leadership, her toughness, and her brains, you know. And so I don't know if she ran into much of a problem with the guys, you know, as far as her being one of the captains of that group. You know, she's never mentioned having to fight that out. I don't know if Shane knows a different story, but it never seemed to me that she had to have that fight with them, you know, or that tension.
Anybody else have if you can, just unmute yourself and feel free to make a comment or ask a question.
Let me go to gallery view. I'd like to start seeing people. Okay.
You can read Simona's chat.
Yes. Simona says, knowing the whole cast of characters, your mom always struck me as being a very strong character. Your dad was always just a sweetheart to me. Thanks for your beautiful presentation. Love and hugs.
Simona, thank you for being here. Simona was like my bestest buddy as a kid. We, grew up together, and we haven't seen each other in a very, very, very long
time.
Yes. It is wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for being
here. You too, Hanala.
Hanala, yes. I'm Hanala, right?
She is to me always.
Yes. Simone and I have been exchanging these little photographs we found of our childhoods lately. My God, and there's, yes. Mm.
Okay, Werner Knur, he's with us tonight. He says, a moving experience. I never knew my opus or omas either. My great aunt also died in Treblinka.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Someday, Amy, you're going to have to take me.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can make it alone. Really.
Okay, Anne says, you've spoken a lot about how your mom dealt with life after the war. What about your father?
My father, for him, it was just, he's always been the protector and the provider. Mm-hmm. And he struggled through, a couple of grocery stores, one in Brooklyn, one in the Bronx, then had an opportunity to learn the building trade. And so he was always had his eyes on how does he bring his family out of a one-room apartment to maybe a little bit, we were always kind of on the move. We moved to an apartment, a working class apartment in the Bronx, and then move another 3 years later to something maybe just a little bit better than that. He was always trying to sort of, that's what he devoted his life to providing for us. And I can remember once asking my mother, we were living in a part of the Bronx called Pelham Parkway, and we were already living there. We were into our 4th year, and we'd moved pretty much every 3 years. And I remember asking my mother when I was about 10 or 11 or whatever, I asked her, I said, are we going to be arrested? And she asked, why should we be arrested? I said, well, because we've lived here 4 years. And she said, so what? And I said, isn't there a law that you have to move every 3 years? So this was So this was my father. This was what my father was really, really engaged in. Just, you know, trying to make our lives better. Just trying to make our lives
I
better.
want to stick this thought in. You mentioned,
Sure, go ahead.
you mentioned that they wouldn't have gotten together except for the war, and then they did, and they had no one else. They came together, and then they started traveling west. My mother, they married. We're not sure what happened first, the marriage or the pregnancy, but you know, it was a end of a war. So my mother told me that because they thought that they would never have children, that they were going to jump on the motorcycle, as you said, and just take off and have adventures and live their lives carefree for as long as they could. And then my mother finds out she's pregnant. And she told me that what she believed was she was going to let him get her to safety into the American zone, then she was going to dump him. Because she could not see that this man was going to be for her what she needed if she's going to have a child. Because he was a party guy. He enjoyed what he enjoyed. By the time they got where they were going, his need to take care of her and protect her and make sure she was okay, by the time they got into the American sector in Germany, she had totally resigned to the understanding that they were in it together forever, that he was totally committed to this family that was going to happen.
Yeah, she was, at some point, she was actually telling him, just get me to the American zone and then you're free to get on your motorcycle and go, no hard feelings. You know, we didn't think that it was going to work out this way, but he, you know, when he saved her, I mentioned before, an assassination plot. When the Soviets came into, you know, when they liberated Poland and they came in and then they occupied, and they assigned my mother, just like the Germans assigned her to the employment agency because she could speak 2 languages and 3 languages and she was literate, etc. Well, the Soviets had the same issues, the same thing going for my mother, in the sense that she could speak a couple of languages, you know, and they could use her as she was used. They could use her literacy skills and her administrative skills. And so they made her the mayor of a town. And she didn't want to be the mayor of a town, but you really couldn't say no. But this became, for the Polish hyper-nationalists, this became proof that the Jews are all communists. This is proof, you know, that, you know, this was the last thing she wanted, was to be mayor of this town. But she was then on a kind of assassination list. And the only reason that she was supposed to go to a meeting one night, and fortunately there was an elder Polish man who had overheard this talk, this assassination talk, told my father. And my father, who she was actually kind of, let's say, trying to keep at arm's length, you know, they kind of had a push-pull relationship. He said, you're getting out of this town and you're getting out of this town tonight and you're not going to that meeting. He just said, that's it, we're out of here. And that, I think, was the moment where he basically, I think in him, she may have waited till she got to the American zone to decide to stay with him. But I think that when he saved her from that assassination plot was when I think he made his decision, is pretty much when I think he made his decision. Getting over the mountain passes to get into Germany, some of it was in very dire, cold conditions. My brother Hal was a newborn baby that was kind of starving to death. There was a lot of, physical trauma, medical trauma. And my father was carrying Hal between 2 huge, to keep him warm, between 2 big down pillows. He almost lost the baby from the bottom, but I mean, he practically broke his back going up and over mountains and hills, carrying this baby between 2 heavy, down pillows. I mean, I think that he made his commitment, in his heart before. He was going to be her soldier. That was it. He was her. I even have a poem that I'm working on, you know, about him being her personal soldier for the next 63 years, basically, you know. Oh, it's wonderful to see Veronica and Leslie and people and Simona. This is one, my daughter, Corinna and Will, right? This is, and Doreen. This is wonderful to see.
I'm just going to edify one of your stories when you
Please.
said mom was a tomboy and you thought she got shot in the head, but it was an injury that she had gotten when she was younger. The injury came because she was climbing on a roof. She fell off the roof and smashed into an iron fence.
Yes, right. Now the hole in her leg was a bullet wound from the war.
We grew up, we had my mother with the bullet in the leg, and we had an uncle who had a bullet in his face. And I truly, truly believe that just like you get to a certain age, you get your period. I really believed you get to a certain age and you get a bullet wound.
These are the things we grew up with.
A bullet hole somewhere in your body. This was, you know,
these are the things.
Passage.
These are the things we thought were normal. Yes, Simona.
This is Simona. Just like you, Shane, or Sheila, as I knew you, I used to think that part of growing up was all of a sudden you would get a Yiddish accent. When I was older, spoke like this.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Part of growing up.
Part of growing up. Part of growing up.
So I'd like to just, hello, first of all.
Hello.
Love to all of you. So having known your mother and your father, of course, and you and all the rest of you, I once asked your mom in the kitchen of the Fresh Meadows house. I don't know how the subject came up, something about God. And I asked her how it is that she could believe in God, considering the experiences and how much loss she'd had. And she turned around, and I think she was scrambling something, an egg, something. She looked at me and she said, "What does God have to do with the Holocaust?" To her, and please, you know, jump in because you know her better than even I did. She said this was about people. Men did this, not God.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little about that side of this life of being the children of survivors, the daughter of survivors, and since you're on the granddaughter of survivors, you know, how has this informed you religiously, spiritually?
That's a great question. I think that I do a low grade, like you talk about a low grade fever. I think I do low grade praying all the time. I think that I live in a state of that kind of prayer in a sense, because I think that that she probably did during the war. But another thing about my mother and God, I think was absolutely necessary to her because she needed somebody to yell at. She needed somebody to yell at. In Jewish tradition, you're allowed to be angry at God. There's nothing, there's nothing blasphemous about it. And
oh God, I must be Jewish.
You must be Jewish because so no, you are. If you have been as far as you can see in life, if you've been something of a righteous person, that you have that right. You have that right. And I think that she spent a lot of years yelling at God and being angry at God and she always knew it's because God could take it. Okay? Because God could take it. And that he had to take it because he owed her.
Yeah.
All right? And that was, right? Would you say, Shane, that was pretty much kind of summarized?
If something was going on in the family that she really was having a very hard time dealing with, never with me, I was always the best child. But when she had a hard time, a really difficult emotional time, she would look up with a finger would go and she'd go, "You owe me." make this better. You know, she had a very, very contentious relationship with God. And for her as children of a survivor, just a quickie, my father-in-law, who had a hard time with religion, and he was very Jewish, but not but probably a Jewish atheist more than anything, asked me if I believed in God. And I said, I really don't know, except when my son at the age of 18 was diagnosed with cancer, the first thing I did was pray. That was the very first. So I said to him, I guess I believe in God, or at least in prayer. And that, you know, that not giving up on that relationship is because my mother never gave up on that relationship.
Well, it also even goes back to what Amy was asking about how mom dealt with the guys, you know, that whole thing. She dealt with the guys the same way she dealt with God. You know, basically, you know, there was it's because also in the covenantal tradition of Judaism, you know, there's the whole idea of like, you know, God and humans are partners. Yes, the person is the junior partner, God is the senior partner, but the whole covenantal relationship is that you're supposed to be working together, all right? So she took that pretty literally. And I guess if you're asking about Veronica's spiritual development, I guess that's come down to me too. I take that pretty literally. Yeah, that sort of, let's say that the covenant means that we're supposed to be repairing, completing the work, the creation that we were given, right?
I'd like to also quote my mother, who was also a Holocaust survivor, just like your parents were, of course. They were all part of the Polish Jewish community. My mother would always say, I'm a cardiac Jew. Always Jewishness in her heart.
In her heart, yeah. This is lovely. It's so wonderful to see you all. Leslie, it's wonderful to see you. It's just absolutely wonderful.
This has just been wonderful. And we could probably sit here and talk all night, but I'm supposed to shut this down at 8:30. Oh, sorry, Anna, 9:30, your time.
Right.
We've been going back and forth all week. Okay, is it your time, my time?
Is it your left or my left? Right, your time or my time? It's like 6:30 your time, 7:30. It's been we've just had such a good time together.
Yeah.
I'm crazy about Amy.
But I wanted to.
We've
got a last question.
Okay.
I just want to thank you very much for your beautiful presentation.
Thank you, Betty.
I love Amy too. So you wrote a beautiful book about my husband, and it's Determined to Survive. And my husband was Max Steinmetz, and he just passed away about 2 months, well, actually March the 4th. And I will say this, my son-in-law at the funeral made a mention which none of us even thought of. He died on March the 4th. He was 96 years old, and he was a Holocaust survivor from the concentration camps. And on March the 4th, he died, and my son-in-law said that his command was for us to march forth. And so, and he did that very well. And Amy wrote a wonderful, wonderful memoir of his life. And she's our adopted daughter. So
thank you, Betty.
Oh,
Betty. I love you.
Love you.
What's the name of the book again?
I get to see her often.
I have the book. Hold on a second. I have the book right over there. I'll bring it over and show it to you. Betty, thank you for being here. I've read the book about your husband. Oh, thank you. I'll go grab the book so you can see.
Oh, Anna, okay. Well,
let's talk amongst
while Anna's doing that, I'm going to do a few last minute announcements. I don't think there's a better way to wrap it up than, Betty, like you said, we're all supposed to march on. And, you know, I know that's what Anna's doing with, and all that she does with her parents. That's the book about Max.
That Amy wrote.
What's the title?
It has
Called
been,
Determined to Survive.
Determined to Survive, with his number on it, on the star.
Yeah.
Right. He went to Eastern Europe. You went to Romania, I think it was.
Uh-huh.
Oh, and she researched in his town. Oh, don't ask what Amy is capable of doing. Oh my goodness.
Oh, well, that's a whole nother story.
let me say that not only did she write the book, but she is using the book as an educating tool, not only here in Birmingham, but in Targa-La-Pouche, where my husband was born.
That's wonderful.
She had arranged a Skype between Max and the kids in Targa-La-Pouche and her children at Shays Valley. She's remarkable. And she even had a plaque made. I don't know how she did it, but she got the mayor of this Targa-La-Pouche to put up a plaque in memory of the 700 plus Jews that were murdered from his community. That was the whole Jewish community, just about. So she's remarkable. And all I want her to do is to continue to do her work because she's so good at it.
You know, it goes back to what Anna was saying. I think there's kind of a special tribe of people who have that passion. And I think that's why all of us are here tonight. And Anna, oh, Leslie, did you? Oh, that's not your hand, Leslie. That's your cat. Okay. We can't thank you enough, Anna, for being here. The only thing that could have been better is if we'd all been in person.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that could have been better. And I wanted to read just a few last kind of wrap up announcements. This has been recorded and we will be posting the recording on our website. But as Ann says, please give us a few days. It won't be there like in 10 minutes. So we need a few days. All of this will be posted on the BHEC website, bhecinfo.org, Birmingham Holocaust Education Center. Please check out our online learning page where you'll see all kinds of additional online opportunities worldwide, all over the place, Holocaust centers throughout the world. All this stuff is being offered free now. That's maybe one bright side of the pandemic, all of these new online opportunities. And on our website, there's one little blurb about this thing called Liberation 75, and we're a participating organization. It's May 4th through 9th. It's free. It's worldwide. It's lots of online seminars, speakers, survivors, liberators. And that is it for tonight. And we just thank everybody so much for joining us. It's been especially great having Anna, your sisters and your daughter and your friends and everybody else. Has just been wonderful. So thank all of you so much for being here. Be safe. Have a good night. Hope to see you soon.